get the Rotary involved.
Recording the meeting here. So,
You know,
President Julie, kick it off, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Here's one of the traditions of Rotary that we start the meeting with a ringing of a bell. So let's try.
Oh, all right. You
And
got
let
it.
us begin.
So
That was a lovely bell. Here.
yeah, good stuff. So I'm going to go around and greet everybody, and then we're going to get on to our speaker for tonight, which is going to be sensational. So Carol's out in the desert, and Marcia's on with us. Great to see you, Marcia.
Hi.
She was up in Ashland, and we're going to introduce our speaker here in a moment, Michael. And Andrea's in Arizona, soon to be up in the mountains, I hope. Barbara's in Santa Barbara. She's the only one of the club that named a city after her. And we got some other folks coming here. A whole bunch of folks coming here at the last minute, so it's good stuff. Mary Justine Lanyon happens to be up here in the mountains with us, and she's the president of Crestline Lake Gregory Rotary Club.
Oh,
and she's also editor of our local newspaper up here. So, MJ, great to see you.
MJ, where are you? Raise your hand.
Yeah, she's right there.
That's terrific.
Yeah. So
I'll come and visit you. I told you that last week, and
yeah. Okay, so Bob McKechnie's out in Cathedral City. Terry's holding on the fort over in Georgia. He didn't get washed away in the storm. So, Robert, great to see you. Ray Naylor, saw you about an hour ago. And Peggy, great to see you. Up in Evanston. Peter, things are good down in San Diego, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yale, we saw you like an hour ago in Taos. Tez, same way. So long time no see. Yeah, Jack, great to see you. And Jack, and you should have got my email that Jack put together here. We're looking for our next nominee for our Peace Award that we give out in our club once a year. So, Jack, great to see you. Mark,
I didn't get my award yet.
Mac, Mark, you don't sleep very much, I guess.
No, not that much. I'm going to nominate Mahmoud Qais from Palestine.
Oh, cool.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Neil, how are you, sir?
I never got my award.
Yeah.
All good, thank you.
Okay,
Glad to
cool.
be here.
Of course, Julie's on. Marilyn King's up in Oakland.
Hi.
Our Olympian. Karen, how are you? No. Tony Holmes is on. Catherine Cooley's.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, gonna do some. And Carolyn's gonna introduce our speaker here shortly. And let's see here.
You said Carol. Rudy, you said Carolyn. I think you meant me.
Catherine. I'm sorry,
Catherine. That's what I asked.
I'm trying to read.
Hi, Catherine.
Read names here. So I'm sorry about that. And Solid on with us. Dennis Wong's our Connecticut Yankee there. Raymond, good to see you, sir.
Yes, good evening.
Good to see you. Ina, how are you?
Well, good here. Great to be here. Good to see you all.
Great to see you. Richard Denton. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Just again, recommend people to join Ending War 101 as a 6-hour course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you would post that in the chat box too, so people join and register there.
You can
Jeannie Marie, how are you?
I'm good. Actually, I had a couple of questions. One is I know the Ending War thing started yesterday, but it's something you do on your own time, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
You can catch up with it, so that's all good.
Great. And if it's in the chat this time, that's even better.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'll
perfect.
make sure.
Yeah, Kurt, great to see you. Mumsy,
Mm-hmm.
you've been around with all your kids. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm doing great.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
I'm watching all your posts on Facebook and everything. Lisa, great to see you.
You too.
Yeah, good stuff. And Ya's on. I don't know that I missed anybody, but we've got kind of a great group on tonight because we got a sensational program tonight. And so I'm going to ask Catherine to introduce our speaker for tonight. Catherine?
Thank you, Rudy. Yeah, so nice to see you, Thomas, and here and have you as our guest. So exciting. So Dr. Thomas Daffern and I met this last spring at the Harvard Divinity Conference, and we scheduled a get to know you meeting afterwards. And I just, in that meeting, became so amazed by what you've done, the amount and level of work that you've done for peace throughout your career, Thomas. And I got, in that conversation, I got really curious about his work in the Ukraine. And I mentioned to him that one of our recent Rotary World Club, Peace Club speakers, Dr. James Garrison, probably a number of you were there, it was back in May, that his talk had shifted my perspective and helped me better understand where Putin and the Russian people might be coming from with regard to this war. And I also had a sense that night that that was true for a lot of other people in the club, just developing this different kind of understanding that we maybe had before, and maybe that what the press has been telling us about the war. And when I mentioned that, Thomas said, yeah, he was familiar with Dr. James Garrison's perspective, and also told me that he had a very different outlook on what is happening there in the Ukraine. So I invited him to share that here with us tonight. And here we are. And he's going to be talking, he's going to be giving us a philosophical and historical perspective on the Russia-Ukraine war. And so I want to say a little bit about Thomas's background for you, and then I'll turn it over to you, Thomas. So Dr. Thomas Daffern has spent many years teaching religious studies, theology, peace and conflict studies, global ethics, history of science, global citizenship, and comparative philosophy to adults, children, and university students. Dr. Daffern is a highly educated, highly trained educator and scholar who has traveled and researched widely, and who brings a truly international perspective to his academic work. Having traveled and lectured in some 35 countries, and has received several international awards for his work in education. He has co-chaired 30 meetings in the House of Lords on ethics and policy, and has spoken twice at the UN headquarters in New York on peace studies and academic development. He serves as the chair of Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, as well as for Ireland and Britain. And when he's not doing all of that work, he's also become a published poet and musician, as well as a novelist, playwright, and actor. He also works as a healer, counselor, and seer, and serves as a member of the Wisdom Keepers Council. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Thomas. Thank you again for being here with us.
Okay, well, thank you for that nice introduction, Catherine. And thank you to all of you, Rudy and everyone else, for coming. Yeah, it's an important topic tonight. You know, the world is going through this traumatic conflict, which, although it's taking place in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, it has global implications. And I'm going to be speaking mainly as a historian tonight and a philosopher. I want to present a bigger picture than normal. And I want to trace back the causes of this conflict over the last few decades. and indeed even further back than that. I got interested in, I started out, you know, as a philosopher, and then I switched and got deeply into history because I felt history is needed as a kind of diagnosis of planetary conflict. To me, a historian is like a medical doctor doing the diagnosis. So what I'm presenting tonight, I'm doing, you know, as a healer, trying to say, what is the cause of this conflict? And I'm going to join up several dots that you may not have realized are connected, or some of you may have. I'm going to talk specifically about, I'm speaking as a British-Canadian dual citizen. I've spent most of my life in Britain, and so I'm very interested in recent British history and the connections to the Ukraine crisis. And I'm going to be starting the talk focusing on Brexit, which some of you may not realize is intimately connected with what later happened, the Ukraine war. I'm going to argue that without Brexit happening, the Ukraine war would not have happened, and that they're designed in exactly the same a set of geopolitical realities. And I'm going to talk about American politics too, and what's been going on in your country for the last 10 years. So bear with me. I'm going to start by looking at Brexit, which is the acronym or name used to describe Britain's decision, actually by a minority of the country, and not by Scotland and not by Northern Ireland, at the behest of the Conservative Party, to take us out of the European Union, which we'd been happily ensconced with as our leading ally for 50 years. And I'm a very opposed to Brexit, an anti-Brexit activist, and I spent the last 4 or 5 years trying to work out how on earth it happened. Where did it come from? I live in France, so I'm a European by choice, but I'm also a patriotic British citizen, and I feel it was the worst decision of British foreign policy since the beginning of the UK. And I've worked out finally how it happened. Bear with me. The referendum of 2016, which is when Brexit was voted on, offered a huge opportunity for foreign powers with malicious interests against the UK to interfere and to take us out of the European Union. The European Union had provided part of the overall security architecture for the UK since we joined way back in 1973. We had a favourable position as both in the transatlantic world, Canada, the USA and NATO, and as acting as a bridge to the largest market in the world, also as the central player in the Commonwealth of 53 nations. Although a small power, we were truly a great power, culturally, intellectually, and even militarily. Who would have wanted to destroy this and to sever our relationships with the EU? Okay, so Brexit was partly caused by internal forces, the greed of the plutocracy, the arrogance of the Eton-educated elites, the wayward lack of self-governance structure in the Tory party, the ignorance of the Prime Minister Cameron in calling the referendum in the first place, the ignorance of Cameron in not putting in a fail-safe majority clause, absolutely unprecedented, the alienation of white working class areas from what they saw as Westminster elites, and the alienation of some immigrant communities from the Indian and African and Caribbean communities who felt alienated from Europe, didn't get the whole Europe thing. And the failure of the UK education system for generations to actually put Europe and its history into the curriculum. And for instance, nothing is in the curriculum about the formation of the European Union or why it came about. There was no European studies in the curriculum. So all these are indeed contributory causes, and each deserves a talk in its own right. But here I'm going to focus just on one aspect, which is what do we know about external forces, i.e. foreign powers with malicious interests against the UK, who seized the opportunity to interfere and take us out of the EU. because it was in their geopolitical interests. And here I'm going to focus mainly on the role of Russia. So a bit more about my background in detail. I did a PhD on the history of the Cold War from 1945 to 2001. I focused on Russian East European history, and I visited Russia. I was elected coordinator of Philosophers for Peace in 1990, a global initiative in Moscow. And my own mother was a Marxist, with whom I had many fantastic arguments growing up. And having read Solzhenitsyn, I was very skeptical of the communist claims of utopia. And the more so when I learned about the excesses of Stalinism and what I regard as the intellectual errors of Marxism. I've been working on a commentary on Das Kapital. The fact is, Marxism lacks any ethical theory as a philosophy. It obviously lacks any spiritual component. So then I was working in peace and conflict studies, looking at war studies as well. And as a historian of the Cold War, I couldn't avoid looking at intelligence, the history of intelligence, which played an important role during that time. I was working on the culture of peace building. So that's, from 1990 to 2023 is 33 years of study, intense study, and I'm trying to share that with you in just, a few minutes. Until quite recently, I've given Russia the benefit of the doubt. I'm a Russophile. I've traveled there. I've got friends in Russia. I've still got some quite important Russian intellectual friends in high places in the philosophical community in Russia. And I would, I couldn't believe they'd be up to any dirty tricks here. I was rather naive. But during the last 18 months, 2 years since the invasion in February 2022, I've been doing a lot of in-depth research in this matter. I've been especially able to benefit from joining Harvard University's Center for Intelligence Studies, which is the leading academic center in the Western world on the history of intelligence, called the Belfer Center. It's in the J.F. Kennedy School of Government. They have online seminars open to academics. And recently I attended a seminar of a book launch there by a man called Dr. Calder Walton, who's actually a British historian of intelligence, called Spies, the Epic Intelligence War Between the East and the West, published this year, just a few months ago. And I've got a copy of the book here, which I strongly recommend people to read. The book traces the Cold War back to 1917, and he documents in full the behind-the-scenes conflict of the Bolshevik government and Western democracies since then, 106 years, during its several phases. When I was, a young philosopher going to Moscow in 1990, we thought euphorically the Cold War was over. Gorbachev had signed a peace treaty. We were going to inherit the peace dividend. We could, forget about the Cold War. It was over. And there was a lot of very positive energy around. And that was when I was elected coordinator of Philosophers for Peace. I remember toasting with my Russian friends with some wonderful red wine, thinking, God, thank God the Cold War's over. However, what Calder Walton reveals, and he's gone to incredible lengths of forensic detail, is that the Russian intelligence apparatus never agreed the Cold War was over. They simply disappeared into the shadows and carried on as usual and bided their time. And the original ideology behind Russian interference in Western democracies was obviously communism. It's morphed into what we can call Russism. Whereas the West stopped doing counter-espionage at several critical times in our history. For instance, during World War II, the British Foreign Office forbade British intelligence operatives to do any more work against Russia. They were regarded as allies in the fight against Hitler, so it wasn't gentlemanly to spy on them. The Russians never did the same. They never reciprocated. They carried on doing dirty tricks. And and against America too. And this is how, of course, they got, you know, a lot of industrial and technical secrets, including the making of the atomic bomb. So we let our guard down entirely, thinking, well, they're allies. But actually, this was an illusion. And we made the same mistake in 1991. We relaxed, but Putin, who, when I was elected coordinator for Fossils for Peace in Moscow, he was driving a taxi around in St. Petersburg, a very grumpy, disillusioned, and angry junior KGB officer who was wanting to figure out a way to get back at the West. And you know, he was putting in place a kind of a fight back. So since then, Putin's rise to power has been all premised on this revanchism of the KGB worldview. Now, the KGB worldview is utterly paranoid. I mean, it has been since the days of Stalin and Lenin. It sees the West as the enemy. It sees liberalism and democracy as corrupt, and you know, feels entirely morally justified in using any and all underhand means to destabilize and destroy us. And Putin has been premising his rise to power by using this apparatus that was never dismantled. He's just changed the names. The playbook remains the same. Any opposition to Putin is essentially silenced. Assassinations are used. His invasions of Chechnya and Georgia, for instance, these are all crimes, actually, that follow an inevitable curve of ascendancy. Now, 9/11 happened, and Calder Walton explains this was the moment at which the West thought, we have a new enemy, Islam, the Middle East. And all our energy in the intelligence community went to watching the terrorists, watching what was going on in Afghanistan and so on. What Calder Walton reveals is that Russia, you know, carried on just plotting revenge against the West, smarting over the kind of apparent defeat they'd suffered with the ending of the Cold War and a determination to reverse it. And China was wooed by Russia to help with this. We should also realize that the Chinese communist state was built, formed, equipped, and effectively created by Stalin's communist regime. His intelligence agents advised Mao, and Mao eventually came to Moscow begging for the atomic bomb, and he was given it by Stalin. Stalin bugged the dacha where Mao was staying outside of Moscow and discovered that Mao was utterly cynical. He had no time for Marxism. He'd never actually read Marx. He said this in one unguarded evening's conversation that was recorded. And he also told Stalin, thank you very much for the bomb. I'll use it. I don't have a problem about using it. Yeah, millions of us will die. Millions of theirs will die, but there's more of us, so we'll win. This kind of thinking actually terrified Stalin. Can you believe that? And some say it led to his early death. He was so shocked. He kind of, you know, he just wanted out. What a crazy world, he thought. There's a very interesting story about Putin when he was a young officer, now in the mayor of St. Petersburg office. He was already plotting a revenge against the West. And he hated and despised the West for its apparent victory in the Cold War. He'd been a junior KGB guy in Dresden. And he'd made alliances in St. Petersburg with the worst of the gangsters and disaffected people in that country. Prigozhin, who has just, you know, died, was one of the people he associated with, who was a gangster. He spent years in prison for violent crime. Those are the kind of people Putin was associating with. And he was looking for any chance he could to take on the UK and the USA. So he was very happy when we started getting bogged down in Afghanistan and the Middle East, Iraq, a totally senseless and ridiculous military operation. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. 9/11 is itself a mystery which has never been fully explained. I've written the first academic historical study of 9/11, 1,000 pages, calling for an international historical commission of inquiry into it, because the true facts are still not known. The American President's Commission of Inquiry didn't get to the bottom of it at all. So all this time, Putin was growing Russia back as a power who centralized control over the economy, created in effect a centralized crime syndicate state, something quite new. He bred his billionaires to be subservient to him, who really commandeered Russian wealth, influence, and prestige, and spread that all over the world, exporting it to the USA, buying up property, buying up influence, also in Europe and in the UK. Russian billionaires moved into London in huge numbers. It's called, in parts, Londongrad, with vast wealth, buying up huge amounts of property. Law firms benefited, but essentially they bought large parts of posh London and the UK press, and also infiltrated the Tory party, which should have been a bulwark against all this stuff. Various Russian billionaire gangsters are known to have donated money openly to the Tory party, and they virtually controlled Boris Johnson through the Lebedevs, a family of intelligence agents. You couldn't make this stuff up, but this is all true, what I'm saying here. So in that crazy situation, when the referendum campaign was called for Brexit by Cameron, and Johnson joined it saying, no, let's leave, this was due to Russian pressure on Johnson. And Johnson gave in, became drunk on the power of what can only be called destructivism. His chief asset here was a man called Dominic Cummings, who'd spent quite a few years in Russia, wined and dined by Russian corrupt elites. And he came back with this same sort of ideology, which can only be called destructivism. It has nothing constructive. There was nothing constructive about Brexit. It was a destructivist thing. And I call this the school of smash first, smash second, and smash third. Never apologize and never answer questions. This is the KGB or GRU school of leadership. And this is what Cummings was doing in the British media. I was watching debates in Parliament. It was absolutely unbelievable. So how was it done? Well, this is where the role of social media comes in. We're into a new territory, which for a historian is very complex and difficult, but Russia interfered with Facebook and social media, using the gifts given to them by a young Canadian chap called Chris Wiley and a firm called Cambridge Analytica, run by Nigel Nix, funded and bankrolled by Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, which enabled them to hack into millions of UK Facebook accounts and place bogus anti-European Union memes. This technology was then given by Cambridge Analytica to Russia, who then started using it. And during this referendum, we now know there's a place in St. Petersburg which was housing these Russian intelligence operatives working for the GRU, thousands of them working full-time to place anti-European Union messages on British social media. And this literally brainwashed UK electors into voting leave, totally against the interests of the country, against all common sense and all rationality. They funded Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks, who were the large donors that gave, illegally actually, support and credence to this Brexit phenomenon that came out of nowhere. Well, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of St. Petersburg. Okay, so you know, this is all being documented and written up. You can read books that have put this together. It's still not accepted in the mainstream British media. This is sort of dangerous knowledge, if you want, because the Tory party is still in hock to these same forces. The current Prime Minister, you know, is in bed with Russian money, and Johnson was up to his neck. So let's move on to Act 2 of this tragedy. This is like a Greek tragedy. Okay, I'm a playwright. I ought to write this up as a Aeschylean tragedy. Brexit was just Act 1 of Putin's engineered disaster. Part 2 was getting Trump elected in the White House. A totally ridiculous concept. The man had no political nous, no political gravitas, no political intelligence or moral intelligence. But if you study the works, particularly of Malcolm Nance, in his work, The Plot to Betray America, and other similar works, you discover that actually, you know, Trump was effectively a Russian asset. He was bankrupt many times over, and each time was rescued by Russian billionaire funding. Russians are buying up his properties and bankrolling his business deals when nobody else would touch it. Chris Wiley's book, Mind, F***CK, explains how it was done in America too. They used Facebook. They hacked into Facebook. They had a way of generating and taking all the data out of Facebook. So they would work out who was a definite Democrat voter, who was a definite Republican, and then who were the people in between. And they targeted them. Who were the people that weren't quite sure who to vote for? Then they would identify their micro details of lifestyle. Were they vegan? Were they gay? Did they like football or basketball? You know, all the details of their consumer habits. They could hoover off Facebook, and they would send directed, targeted messages to appeal to that demographic, saying Trump's the guy that can save America. Hillary Clinton is a horrible person. She's a witch, you know, all the sort of horror things that were spread at that time. A lot of it was done from Russia and with Russian agents, either in America or remotely. And this is not speculation. This is fact. You know, I think it's absolutely the case that Trump committed treason. I find it incredible that he's not yet in prison. I think he will be before long. He colluded definitely with Russia against the USA from within. Trump also gave his continuing support to Brexit, recognizing it was part of the same playbook. And I was sickened when Trump came to Britain and met the Queen, and they all, you know, bon ami and all that. But this was a tragedy in the making. Okay, so what's the thinking behind all this? Well, we can call it the alt-right. This is Steve Bannon's phrase. What is the alt-right? What's its ideology? Well, I call it Putinized homophobia, religious fanaticism, Christian nationalism, and racist white supremacy. It's like the Ku Klux Klan on steroids. And this is the stable that both Trump and his supporters and Putin came from and come from. You've got to realize this is the ideology behind Putin's Russia. Russism is a joining together of Russia and fascism. And it colonized, to my great shame, the Conservative Party in the UK. And Brexit was its first triumph. Its second triumph was the inflaming of America with Trumpism, creating unbelievable divisions in your hitherto stable kind of consensus democracy. Okay, and what's the third element of this tragedy? The third element was the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, in February. it follows from the other two. What was the ideology that Putin announced to explain his invasion of Ukraine? Well, it was this alt-right ideology. He was going in to defeat Satanists, drug takers, homosexuals, deviants. Ironically, fascists, which is just, it's a Russian word meaning, the devil, but actually it's like looking in a mirror and shouting at yourself. Actually, what Putin was trying to do is destroy good old-fashioned European liberal democracy. People who'd believe in freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of sexuality, all the values that the European Union actually stands for, and that France, where I'm speaking from, has in our constitution, as does the European Union in its Charter of Rights and so on. This is what really annoys Putin, because we actually have the freedoms he doesn't want to grant to his own people. And this is written up most importantly by a Professor Timothy Snyder, this single book, The Road to Unfreedom. If you haven't read it, when you leave this, get it and read it. It's a really, really important book, The Road to Unfreedom. He's professor at Yale, professor of history, and he's my sort of equivalent in the US. What have we learned from all this? What lessons are to be taken away? Gosh, wars start with lies and miscommunication. You probably know that World War II started when Russia invaded Poland and Germany invaded Poland simultaneously because of a pact made by Stalin and Hitler. That information, by the way, is no longer allowed to be shared in Russia. If I, as a historian, say that, which is factual, I can be arrested and imprisoned. Truth has now become a threat to Putin's totalitarian regime, which, as someone that dearly believes in academic freedom, I find intolerable. So lying can lead to temporary power on the part of the people that lie, but it dissolves and corrodes the very civilization on which structures and institutions which have been built up over centuries flourish. It came close to Trump's lies came close to destroying American democracy in the invasion of the Capitol, a very symbolic act by a deviant minority. So okay, so which academics am I basing all this on? If I've held up a few books, I would say Tim Snyder's probably one of the most important intellectuals saying this. He's explored in detail the three-part phase that I'm explaining, in which the war in Ukraine is just the third phase. You can't understand the war in Ukraine, I'm arguing, unless you understand these other two. And what upset me about Jim Garrison's analysis is that he completely ignores the bigger picture. He completely ignored the first bit. As do pro-Putin apologists. They tend to blame NATO for the situation, which is absolutely ludicrous, because the East European states that wanted to join NATO, like the Baltic nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, they were afraid of Russia. They knew what it had been like living under Russia's rule, so they wanted the protection NATO offered. It wasn't that NATO went wooing them. It's just that we didn't say no when they begged to join. The other book I would, as I say, recommend is this book, Spies, which gives the intelligence background to everything I'm saying and backs up this idea of a three-part, action against the West. We really need to wake up to what's been going on. What should be our response? Well, it has to be truth. That's why I'm talking to you. That's why I have a duty as a teacher and an academic to share what I've learned after years of study, because it's amazing still the misinformation you can pick up from so many sources like Fox News or whatever. Malcolm Nance, who's written a whole slew of books about this, is an extraordinary man. He's in American military intelligence. He's a very clever man. he's gone off to volunteer in Ukraine because he realizes the future of the West is now being fought out in Ukraine. If Russia succeeds in its military operation against Ukraine, you know, that's democracy suffers a terrible blow. Another scholar I recommend is a woman called Catherine Belton from London, who's explored in great detail the web of finances that Putin built, how he's amassed this vast personal wealth, and how he basically bought influence in London and took over the Tory party and funded Johnson. The whole thing is there in detail. She works for The Economist. She took a few years off work to research this and has contacts all over that have, you know, revealed sources. Another very important figure to read is Craig Unger. You probably know of him. His book, American Compromat, which is about Trump's being bought by Russian influence and Russian money. And he's documented the whole thing. You know, he's an amazing investigative journalist and writer. There's a chap called Angus Roxburgh in Britain who's written The Preachers of Hate, The Rise of the Far Right, which documents the rise of fascism in sadly, it's one of the things about democracies, you know, they're tolerated, these minority voices, but they've been amplified by social media and by the deliberate placing of support by Putin, who's been wooing the far right in France, in Germany, and in America, and in Britain. He also woos the far left, I should say. Putin is very sophisticated. He's wooed the, you know, the socialist left as well. And then there's a chap called John Sweeney, his book Killer in the Kremlin, which came out last year, again reveals what Putin's been up to. So look, this is my report on the background to the Ukraine conflict. You can see, I hope, why I take a slightly different view than Jim Garrison. I think this is a really serious situation we're in, and we need to really get our act together, join up these dots. I'm campaigning, one thing I can do is get Brexit reversed. As a Liberal Democrat campaigner, it's like the equivalent of the Democrat Party in the UK, we're trying to get this thing reversed because it was a mistake. It was the result of a military psyops done against the British people. And anyway, look, let's have some discussion. By all means, questions. And I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Jean, you have your hand up.
Yeah,
Jean
so
Moore,
Jean, you have a question, Jean?
I do. I'm wondering if all of these books and their authors could be put in the chat, because I'm fascinated. I believe everything you're telling me. It makes complete sense to me. But I'm curious what you think we in this country could do.
Yeah, well, just stay vigilant. Don't let Trump get anywhere near the White House again. That's the most important thing, you know, make sure he goes to jail. And that this comes out. The American people, I love you. You're intelligent, you're wise. You are a multicultural nation. You fought through a lot of struggles to get where you are. Don't let this alt-right white racist nonsense push you back, you know, 100 years or 200 years. I can send my reading list. I can send a paper to you know, to Rudy by email, and then maybe he can circulate it.
Please.
Okay.
That'd be great. You know, and part of this, David's got his hand up too. I guess you kind of mentioned this coming up. Obviously, we have a new election coming up here, and being careful of this. David Wick, question?
Yeah, so thanks for laying all of this out. So where do you see it going, the trajectory going as things are now? And what's the turning point that we can help influence?
Well, I think, you know, as a good Kantian philosopher, I would say pursue moral virtue in your own personal and professional lives. If you're a historian, do really good history. If you're a teacher, teach brilliantly. You know, we need an invisible moral shield to protect the Western values that are so important: democracy, human rights, the right of free speech, the right to give talks like this and not be arrested and hauled off and shot. You know, I mean, everything that my civilization, European civilization, has labored for centuries is at stake here. We're being attacked by a totalitarian guy who invokes Genghis Khan as his role model. The Russian people have looked back to Genghis Khan. He used to slaughter whole cities and pile up skulls to frighten people, you know, as Mao did when he invaded Tibet. You know, they were doing what's called political cannibalism against the Tibetan people. That's the kind of forces we're up against here. And if you don't believe me, read a book called Tibet, Oh Tibet, which documents that. It's historically fact. Yeah, so I don't know what you all do professionally, but just whatever you're doing, do it better and do it from the heart. It's ultimately the energy of, Spinoza said, peace is a strength of heart. He's one of the great intellectuals behind European democracy. That is you know, a really important quote to me. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Neil and then Jack.
Yes, thank you, sir. Very, very erudite presentation. I'm an academic like you, and I'm originally from India and living here in the US for a long time. Anyway, I've been very fascinated by this larger cycles of sort of geopolitical shifts. And I've been listening to a lot of people, and some of them are clairvoyants, and they sort of are able to look back thousands of years. And they say they actually, some of them predicted like a couple of years ago that something major will shift on 2/22/22. And just the very next day, this Ukraine war was announced. And what I've also been hearing, and sort of coming from various parts of India and elsewhere, that sort of a lot of the problems in the world have been sort of being generated by America and UK in divide and conquer kind of things. But then what I'm hearing is that during 2022, power is really shifting from the global north to the global south. And just today, I saw a report that 3 consecutive G20 meetings will be held in the south: Indonesia last year, India this year, and then Brazil next year. So it looks like a lot of the power shift is happening global south, and this whole fight between America and Russia is like an internecine fight, which sort of, I don't know why that's happening, but it is happening, and they could keep themselves, lose power to a more peaceful south, which G20, at least in India, which is happening in next week, later this week, they're talking about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, world is one family, and operating from that principle. And I would imagine they mean it because it goes back thousands of years of philosophy. What do you think about shift of power beyond Ukraine, Russia, staying to global north and south? Thank you.
Sorry, Anil, what's your field as an academic?
My field is management and peace studies. So I'm devoted to world peace. I'm at Maharishi International University, home of transcendental meditation. We have done the foremost research on collective consciousness. By group meditation, we create currents and the collective consciousness to create world peace.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm a great fan of that institution and the work you do. I'm a great lover of India. I've been to India 10 times. I'm going again in February to do a conference on nonviolence and peace with the Jain community in Rajasthan. I'll send the details of that if anyone's interested.
I am.
I feel India could be doing a lot more in the way of peacemaking. I'm a great admirer of India's idea of non-alignment, going back to Nehru, this idea we don't want to get involved in the war. But I think that shouldn't be just a negative thing, like we're not going to get involved. I'd like to see India developing much more active peacemaking outreach. I propose an Indian mediation service should be set up with all the wisdom of India, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Sikhs, the Jains, and the whole technology of consciousness that your university stands for. You should be sending teams of mediators to both Ukraine and Russia, making them sit down and meditate and saying, look, guys, let's think of a better way of doing this. We've got to think outside
I can't do it.
That dualistic, old paradigm, us versus them kind of thing, which is theologically ingrained in the West. It's white versus dark. It's good against evil. There's a much more holistic way of looking at this stuff. And that actually is the metaphysics underlying democracy. Spinoza was the guy that said, no, God is in everything. God is in all matter and energy and time and space. Einstein believed in Spinoza's God. If we can up-level our thinking about peace and conflict to that more holistic paradigm, India could pioneer that. So instead of sort of sitting on the fence and colluding with the war, she could be pioneering, de-escalation and sublimation of conflict, So I think, and then power would shift to the south. Power would then shift to the right, wisdom keepers in Africa and Latin America, and the global south is the wisdom, powerhouse of the world. We came from Africa, for God's sake. So let's honor the south, but let's also honor the north. Let's not have a new Cold War between north and south. Let's make this a one world that we have a win-win. So that's kind of a brief response. Yeah. Jack, what's your question?
Yeah, I've got two questions. One's a quick one. The other one, I want to follow up, peace strategies you mentioned to end that war. But the first question is, given the deterioration of the economy in the UK, do you think there's greater support now to overturn Brexit and return to the EU?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, it's growing. It's a backlash. The forces that brought about Brexit are still very powerful, still dominate the media, still dominate the BBC, but gradually chinks are appearing in the narrative. I mean, when I lived in Britain, I left in 2017. There were no food banks, right? I mean, that's just unheard of. Britain is a wealthy country. There are now thousands of food banks. People cannot afford to eat and pay their electricity bills and their rent. I mean, this is shocking. And that's all a result of Brexit. Eventually, the penny will drop.
It always was.
Yeah.
What's your
second
question,
Carol, and Thomas, the second question is building up mediation. There's some discussions happening that maybe the way to end a war between Ukraine and Russia is the Korea model, where you start negotiations even while the two sides are still battling each other, and you would bring together people from non-aligned countries. They mentioned India as one, other countries, to try to see if they can come up with a solution. And at the same time, you have the United Nations United Nations would facilitate that. They'd also facilitate discussions directly between Ukraine, Zelensky and Putin, to see if the non-aligned nations, coupled with direct negotiations, can come up with some temporary pause that would guarantee security for Ukraine and hope for a longer-term solution, but at least stop the violence that's taking place. What's your reaction to that approach that's being discussed?
Well, I've got two levels of reaction. First, I'm a great believer in citizens diplomacy. That's how we ended the Cold War. We had these connections between professional groups. Doctors, if you recall, medical specialists said, look, we can't afford a nuclear war. It's going to end life on the planet. we need to reactivate all those, and Rotary can play an important role in this, I think. In terms of how you get the diplomats and the military top brass to talk to each other, there are ways of doing that. I've thought of a few suggestions myself. One very simple thing we could do is, whenever we have a diplomatic conference of peacemakers, in Geneva or wherever it is, give them a day's detox, give them all a really intensive aromatherapeutic massage by qualified people, get them into a peace zone before they're allowed to go into the negotiating room. Because these guys are so armored, and they're there with their, sort of mental armor on, that they won't talk about peace. Get them realizing that peace is an actual, tangible birthright to all of us. And I'm not joking, aromatherapeutic massage is a tremendous tool in that. So I think we should be, that's how Camp David and stuff happened, because they all got in the hot tub. I think we should be pioneering that much more human approach to negotiation and diplomacy. That's what and the UN should be supporting this behind the scenes. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all have our physical bodies and our emotions. And once they're smoothed over, we can then look at the other as another self. And then you can start the peace talks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thomas, that's a great analogy there. Dr. Barbara, and then Richard and Bob McKechnie.
I'm very grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for your presentation, Thomas, and your perspective and the level that you call us to consider this. I have worked in the Soviet Union, in Europe, and Estonia, and for most of the past 30 years. And for 20 of it, I've been in Ukraine. And I don't disagree with anything you've said. And my favorite guiding principle comes from Buckminster Fuller, who I had the grace to meet and work with at New Dimensions Radio. We recorded so much of him. And he says, you don't change the current reality by fighting against it. If you want to have a new reality, create a new model, and the old one will fall away. And the Dalai Lama comes along and says at the same time, why don't we see that war is an outdated method of settling our differences? Well, the only reason that we don't see it and that we don't stop fighting it is there's money to be made by it. There's tons of money to be made by war, and power and authority. And when you say get all those, negotiators into the massage parlor first, I mean, I led a project in Finland. I was the only woman. It was my project. And all those men would go into the sauna at night. And that's where they would make their decisions. And that's where they would discuss things. So I had to go there too. It was bold and insane, but I did it because we have to. But how can you get these programmed people? They're not even accessing wisdom anymore. How do we get them to know that they need to remember their humanity and feel their body? How do we do that? I mean, we used to march in the street, we used to do letter campaigns. What do we do?
Are there any teachers on this call? Any educators?
Yeah.
Hands up if you're some kind of a teacher. I mean, the answer has got to be education, long term. We need peace education in every school and a peace studies department in every university. And Rotary is helping, push in the right direction there. But we need more help from UNESCO. This should be a priority, and that will help change people's attitudes. People still think war is inevitable because there's profits in it. Okay, my main complaint about Das Kapital, is that Marx never once mentioned the relationship between capital formation and war. It's the huge elephant in the room of capitalism. He never mentions in his entire work the link between why people that like accruing capital want to invest in ever increasingly sophisticated weaponry, because it's the best way to make fast profits. It's a fatal mistake he made in his theories. So I'm saying we need to revisit that, look at the links between capitalism and the false antidote to capitalism, which was Marxism. Well, it failed because he didn't do his homework. We have to rethink capital and put it to the genuine service of human needs and society, a bit like Thomas Piketty is saying in France here. You know, economists are thinking this through, but yeah, we need an economic system that services peace. At the moment, we have one that services war. That has to be deconstructed, and I'm part of that intellectual attempt. And it sounds like you are too, Barbara. So keep up the good work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. We got a
Richard.
couple more questions. We're coming up on the end of the hour here, but Richard and then Bob, please.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Fully again agree with your thinking. And as you can see behind me, I'm into education, ending war.
Right.
Through conscious raising. I'm wondering, though, what is your take on Putin using nuclear weapons or destroying the nuclear power station in Zaporizhzhia?
Yeah. I mean, this is the worst possible nightmare scenario, isn't it? I mean, would he be that mad? I pray and hope that he wouldn't be that crazy. I don't think. I hope and pray there's enough people in the system that would stop it, even if he said, let's launch a nuclear war against Ukraine. There are still good people. You may have seen that documentary, The Man Who Saved the World, about a junior Soviet officer who prevented World War III. I believe those guys would not let it happen. You know, it's and if you've not seen Oppenheimer yet, go and see the movie, because Oppenheimer foresaw the problem of nuclear armed powers fighting it out. He wanted it to go to the UN, and nuclear weapons shouldn't be in the hands of nation states. I wish we could roll back history and do that. It's how we do that, I don't know. I'm a believer in ridding nuclear weapons from the planet as a whole. But for that, we have to transform human beings into more loving and intelligent versions of themselves, which is a job for educators and miracle workers. Yeah.
Well, there's no shortage of work there. Bob, and then we'll wrap this up. Bob McKechnie.
Okay, I'll say quickly. I had a question about 2 minutes ago. What do you do about the people who make money from war? Now, the thing is, and then I listened carefully to the conversation when it came up, and I still didn't hear much of a solution.
Well, first
That's
we can
my
identify.
question.
Yeah, no, great question, Bob. That's the $1 million question. Thank you. We've got to first identify the problem and realize that our current economic models haven't addressed it. The left, with all its rhetoric about peace, has never got there. Marx refused to go to a peace conference chaired by Victor Hugo, for instance. He said, peace? I don't want peace. So we need to get the left to really, put its thinking caps on. The right, with its trickle-down economics and its more wars good for business and all that, they need to go back and do their homework. So this is a job for, I run the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum as well. It's one of my hats. I think it was mentioned. So I tend to work through and with intellectuals, but at the grassroots, the more people that can ask questions, the economy is not working. The planet has enough.
I want to say one more thing, if I could.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if there was a clean and clear and easy profit, it doesn't matter who you hurt. And that's deeply ingrained in us. So you can see it with tobacco and a bunch of other things, the medications, that kill people.
Well,
how can we deal squarely with that issue?
Sure. Well, we need to reconceptualize what we mean by profit, don't we? There's a laziness in thinking about profit. in superficial forms of capitalism. I actually have a slogan that I use sometimes, which is from profits to profits. You know, we need to shift people's thinking away from profit with an I to actualizing the prophetic consciousness which is within us all, which thinks in terms of the whole. And you know, in a nutshell, that would be my answer. But it's, you know, I can send you more details. It's something I've thought through a great deal. Yeah. Barbara, you got a final one, have you? Go for it.
Yes, thank you. We need to vote with our money. We need to spend money on constructive things. We need to have the courage to do the things that are uncomfortable, inconvenient, and everything else that say what our values are. That's one thing. When I worked in the Soviet Union, there was a moment, there was a segue moment where we could have been part of the solution. And we chose not to be, as a nation, as a government, as a system. And but there was a moment, and we were there, part of that moment. And it didn't work because not enough people believed in the possibility that we could ever get it together to work together. So the financing wasn't there for perfectly fantastic joint ventures where everybody would have made money and everybody would have had their interdependence with each other's finances. And I used to beg people to, you know, I mean, we were playing with huge companies, and the CPA would say, well, a 42% ROI is what we need, and you've only got a 28%, so that's not enough. It's like, holy,
yeah.
You know, I mean, but the other piece was that the Soviets were taking their military factories and learning to make vacuum cleaners and refrigerators and stuff like that. Well, there was money for that for a little while. And that would have gone a long way to kind of shifting the trajectory of the possibility that we might, you know, we might be able to bridge this gap.
Well, keep that thought, keep that moment frozen in time. As a historian, I believe that no time is ever gone forever. You can still draw on the energies of that positivity even now. I was at a meeting at the UN giving a talk, and there was a guy from Russia who was charged by Gorbachev to transform Russian military factories to peace uses. And there was a guy from the American state system who was doing the same in America. I was in the room with the two guys, right? That was the same moment you're talking about. I just want to end with one final point, which is, you mentioned the arts, I think, somebody, and you were saying, what do we do? I just want to flag up the arts. I'm also a poet and a great believer in the power of art, the arts generally. And I'm the education coordinator for the Delphic Games. You may not have heard of this, but the Delphic Games were the equivalent to the Olympic Games. They ran for 1,000 years, on the same 4-year cycle, but 2 years after the Olympic Games. They ran from about 500 BC to about 500 AD. And they brought together artists, poets, dancers, musicians from all over Greece and you know, the Hellenic world to Delphi to compete for, and not for prize money, but for the laurel wreath that comes from Apollo. And we've revived them. They're based in Berlin. So I just wanted to flag that up. You know, if you're an artist, that's about building something positive. I also met Buckminster Fuller, so I'm with you on that one. Let's build the Delphic Games and create a world of beauty. That's worth saving. That's worth living in. Melissa, go on. Last question.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, of all the books you mentioned and all the authors, is there one you could recommend that would really give the factual information about Donald Trump being involved with the Russians and Brexit and all that?
I can
well, read American Compromat by Craig Unger. It's very straightforward, easy to read. The facts are all there.
Okay.
If you can only read one book about Trump, read that thing. If you want the details, read Malcolm Nairn's Yeah.
Okay, thank
But
you
I'll
very much.
send the reading list. I'll send the reading
Okay,
list.
great.
For home
Thank you.
to read it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's good.
Thanks so much for your talk.
Yeah, Thomas,
welcome,
thank
thanks.
you for sharing with us tonight. We really appreciate that. But you said that Rotarians need to do more work, so we invite you to be a Rotarian in our E-Club of World Peace to help us lead the charge. And we would love to have you as a member of our club.
So tell me about the club. Is it an international thing? Can I join
Exactly,
even in
yeah.
France?
So E-Club of World Peace, we're in 26 states and 9 countries. And so we're connected around the world in our club. And we created this from 2016 when I convened a Rotary International Peace Conference in Ontario, California. And we started that from there. And we've grown this club now to almost 90 members globally. And so we have a global reach, and we would love to have you join us. So.
No, I'd be honored. Send me an email with more details.
I will absolutely do that, Thomas. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'll do it on behalf of the French Republic.
Yeah.
Vive la France.
Very good. We have one of our members, the first club president, was Emmanuel Etier, and he calls himself a French bulldog. So he's and does documentary films. So good folks out there that we deal with.
Please circulate the reading list, okay?
Yeah, I will circulate that reading list that Thomas shares with me, and we'll get that. Thomas, thank you so much for sharing tonight.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And thank you for being there. I don't feel like it's 4:41 at all here, but I guess it's bedtime.
It's probably your time for bedtime. Yeah. Probably way past that. So we thank you so much for being on with us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to having you as a member.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Wow.
Thank you.
President Julie.
Shalom from the Middle East.
Yeah, shalom.
Oh,
thank you, Thomas.
What a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Wow.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll talk.
Inspiring.
This week, really.
Yeah. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.